Mr Speaker, to the Minister of Climate Change Issues, what reports has he seen on the introduction of the ETS in the last week?
The Honourable Dr Nick Smith.
Mr Speaker, in the last week I've read reports from the opposition that there has been a dramatic increase in the cost to taxpayers from industry allocations. This claim from Charles Chauvel is not true. While some small and medium-sized businesses, and more of them, have become eligible for allocations under our fairer model, some larger firms have not. The total allocation to industry remains unchanged at 12 million tonnes.
Nicky Wagner.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. To the Minister of Climate Change Issues, how can the claim from Charles Chauvel, Nick Smith's changes to the ETS will add an extra 5% to the price of power be true when the government's amendments passed last year reduced the impacts of the ETS on power prices?
Order. Point of order, the Honourable Trevor Mallard.
Do I need to explain it, Mr Speaker? I mean, none of that question was the Minister's responsibility, because the whole question was based on how can he explain Charles Chauvel. None of us can do that, sir, and the Minister certainly can't.
Order. I guess, order. I'll hear from the Honourable Jerry Brownlee in a moment once I've restored order to the House, but it was my fault that got out of hand.
Mr Speaker, I think it's a perfectly legitimate question because it asks the Minister to comment on Mr Chauvel's comments about the Minister. And in that case, it's perfectly legitimate.
Order. The interesting thing is, on the face of it, the question would normally be out of order, and that one would normally argue the Minister is not responsible for any comments Mr Chauvel might make. But as I heard the question, it asked how those comments relate to the actual policy the government is pursuing. Now, I would have thought, so long as the Minister's answer confines itself more to how those comments relate to the policy the government is actually implementing, it would seem to me it's in order. If the answer focuses totally on Mr Chauvel's comments, then the Minister does not have responsibility for those comments per se. But how they relate to the government's policy, I believe, is something within the Minister's responsibility.
Mr Speaker, the amendments that the government made to the emissions trading scheme have more than halved the cost to power consumers. We have done that by halving the obligation and including in our amendments a price cap of $25 per tonne. It's extraordinary for the members that are shouting out to complain about increases in power prices when they voted against the amendments that more than halved them.
Nicky Wagner.
To the Minister of Climate Change Issues, has the Minister seen any reports on differing views on the $1.6 billion of carbon credits from post-1990 forest owners?
The Honourable Dr Nick Smith.
Mr Speaker, yes I have. I've seen a report that states that post-1990 forest credits are a property right, that they belong to the forest owners and that they must not be confiscated by the government. I've also seen a statement which said the same credits are described as a subsidy and that it would be criminal of the government to allocate those to the foresters. The first statement is from Rodney Hyde. The second is from John Boscowan. These dramatically opposed positions tell us why we cannot take X policy on the ETS seriously.
Question. I beg your pardon, Charles Chauvel.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Does the Minister endorse the view expressed in Christchurch on Friday at the Australian Institute of Company Directors annual conference? Quote, I've always been fairly sceptical, actually, that Kyoto is the right way to go, end quote, and, quote, from New Zealand's point of view, we're really trying to have a gentle glide path that takes us into a logical way of addressing that, end quote.
Mr Speaker, it certainly is the view of this government that we need to take a steady and consistent approach around climate change. We campaigned on a policy of pulling back on the very ambitious ETS that the previous government put in place. that would have had a very high impact on power prices, a very high impact on consumers, and I think New Zealanders support the very moderate approach that this government is taking to this important issue.
Charles Chauvel.
So, to the Minister, when the Prime Minister said he'd always been fairly sceptical, actually, that Kyoto was the right way to go, did he seek any advice from the Minister prior to making that statement?
The Honourable Dr Nick Smith.
Mr Speaker, the Prime Minister is very much on top of the balanced approach that this government is taking around climate change. And the part that I'm particularly proud of is that we don't have a Prime Minister going around the world saying that we are going to be the first carbon neutral country in the world at the same time as our emissions are going up at a faster rate than any other country.
Point of order, Charles Chauvel.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I seek leave to table a transcript of the Prime Minister's comments on Friday at the Australian Institute of Company Directors annual conference.
Leave is sought to table that document. Is there any objection? Order. I take it there's no objection so long as it is the whole document. Question number of supplementary question, the Honourable Rodney Hyde.
Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Order. I've called the Honourable Rodney Hyde. Order.
To the Minister of Climate Change Issues, has he seen any reports of the National Party's Central North Island Conference in which 300 members over unanimously passed a remit demanding the National-led government defer the introduction of the emissions trading scheme? And isn't this an example of the pragmatic, honest, hard-working, grassroots members of the National Party simply wanting National to stick to its promise of not leading the world on climate change?
The Honourable Dr Nick Smith.
Mr Speaker, National campaigned on a policy of in 2009 amending the emissions trading scheme and in 2010 proceeding with an emissions trading scheme. That is exactly what we are doing. I was privileged to give a speech to the conference at the Central North Island, and I have to say I was very well received by delegates, and the member's report is not correct.
The Honourable Rodney Hyde.
To the Minister for Climate Change Issues, who is right? The Minister who says that New Zealand should stick to its emissions trading scheme, no matter the facts, no matter what the rest of the world does, or National Party members up and down this country who say that National should stick to its promise and tuck in beside Australia, not run ahead of the rest of the world?
Dr Nick Smith.
Mr Speaker, firstly, I'd say that the member should reflect on his promise to foresters in which he said that they belong to those that have planted the trees.
Order. The member was asked a question that didn't involve the Honourable Rodney Hyde at all, yet the Minister's answer is saying what the questioner should do. I don't think that's a fair attempt to answer the question.
Mr Speaker, the policy that National is progressing on the emissions trading scheme is exactly what we said when we campaigned in 2008, and that was proceeding with a moderated emissions trading scheme. The member makes the claim.
Point of order, David Garrett.
Mr Speaker, the question was, if not a yes or no answer, a very simple who is correct, A or B. This is a disquisition on something completely different about National's policy. It's still not an attempt to address the question.
Speaking to the point of order, the Honourable Dr Nick Smith.
The member who asked the question made the claim that National was not following policy. And I was setting out exactly what the policy was and the way in which the government is implementing it.
Order. I don't need endless points of order on the question. The fact that the Minister has spoken to the point of order and believes the question asked something that I didn't actually hear in the question, I invite the Honourable Rodney Hyde to repeat his question. The Honourable Rodney Hyde.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Climate Change and asks this. Who is right? The Minister who says that the government should stick to its emissions trading